across Europe in the spring of 1945, there was an air of expectancy. For a long time now, the question had been not whether Nazi Germany would be crushed, but how soon. The war was in its 6th year. For nearly 4 of those years, the Soviet army had first suffered, then recovered gloriously, and now was about to exert its full might against the capital of the Thousand-Year Reich. In its wake from the Baltic to the Black Sea, through the wide plains of Belorussia and the Ukraine, the Red Army left the wreckage of the German war machine. The Soviet High Command had completed its plans for this last battle in November 1944. It was to begin on January 20th, 1945. Berlin was 75 miles away, across the River Oder. With much of their land already devastated, the Germans decided to throw everything they had left into this gigantic confrontation. They succeeded in mustering 1 million men, 10,000 pieces of artillery, 15,000 tanks, 3,300 aircraft, all protected by mile upon mile of strong fortification. The Germans meant to contest the Oder and had prepared accordingly by blowing the bridges. Behind the East Bank, the Soviets massed their force. It amounted to 193 divisions, 2.5 million men, 42,000 artillery pieces, 6,300 tanks, and 7,500 aircraft. In all, a superiority of between 2 and 4 to 1 in men and equipment. Recognizing the size of the Soviet concentration, Hitler conceived one last desperate idea. If the Red Army could be held in the East, the Americans and British might accept softer terms than unconditional surrender. But Roosevelt and Churchill had promised Stalin that Berlin would be a Soviet target. There would be no deals with the Nazis. On April 2nd, Zhukov, commander of the First Belarusian Front, came back from the final conference in Moscow. Stalin had given Zhukov the honor of taking the German capital. The operation was complex. In essence, Zhukov's Belarusian armies were to strike directly west to Berlin. Marshal Konyev's first Ukrainian front would head for Leipzig, then north. Rokossovsky's second Belarusian front to the north would force the Oder and advance to the Elbe. what Nazism had promised was at stake. The glorification of the Aryan virtues, the years of racism and terror, of militarism and the brute excitement of the mob were coming to an end. Finally, after all the conquests, it was the Götterdämmerung. All were drawn into this last act. The Nazis banded them into Volkssturm battalions. The Nazi youth performed its last duties, not knowing how close extinction was. They were brave, these children, and dangerous. Hitler emerged from his bunker in the heart of Berlin to hand out decorations, offer encouragement, act the kindly father. It was Adolf Hitler's last public appearance. The message: Germany will remain German. It was a beautiful, gentle morning, with the spring sun beginning to lift the mist. It was April 16th, 5 a.m. Behind the first wave of the Soviet assault, they had mounted 143 searchlights to blind the enemy. Within hours, Zhukov committed the rest of his armor and all of his planes. The Germans' outlying defenses were swiftly crushed, but they'd crammed men into thick defensive positions on the Zilo Heights, about 30 miles from Berlin. There, the battle became most intense. The Germans rushed in anti-aircraft artillery to slow the Soviets. But on April 18th, after a two-day fight, the Red Army overran the heights. The attack on Berlin was going as planned. Marshal Konyev had developed his southern attack at speed and with success. The Soviet High Command now ordered Konyev to swing two tank armies north in the direction of Berlin. In the north, Marshal Rokossovsky thrust forward. Marshal Rokossovsky's armies of the Second Belarusian Front forced the Oder at its branch. They had to cross 2 stretches of open water and 2.5 miles of flooded swamps between them, all under heavy fire. Zhukov, Konyev, Rokossovsky. Each wanted the honor of having his troops first in Berlin. Rokossovsky's assault engineers were hard-pressed. By nightfall, Rokossovsky's armor was beginning to cross, to roll towards Stettin and the Elbe. The Luftwaffe sent up what strength it had against the dominant Red Air Force. There were Soviet aces present. One of them, Major Kozhedub, added 2 kills to his total of 60. Sometimes the Red Air Force spotted American bombers on their own missions. German reinforcements were destroyed on their way forward. To the west, Russia's allies were across the Rhine and threatening the Ruhr. The Americans by the Remagen Bridge, the British by amphibious assault. Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill had agreed that the Western Allies would first take the bomb-ravaged cities of the Ruhr and then meet the Soviets on the Elbe. Southward, American and French spearheads would thrust for Bavaria, Czechoslovakia, and Austria. In Berlin, 400,000 civilians built barricades from the ruins of their own homes. Every street, every building was to be defended. Berlin, Zhukov knew, covered 350 square miles, all heavily fortified. At 1:50 p.m. on April 20th, the 4th day of the battle, Zhukov's long-range artillery opened fire on the city. Berlin's outer defenses began to crumble. Within the capital, there was chaos. Normally the most submissive of people, the citizens took to the streets, driven by starvation. And intoxicated with greed. All discipline, all social order had been wiped away in the hours of fear and destruction. German armored commander commented, "April 20th was the hardest day. My troops had already suffered tremendous losses. They were worn down and exhausted, no longer able to resist the tremendous thrust of the superior Russian forces." Berlin's airport, the Tempelhof, scene of so many of the Nazis' welcomes and farewells to foreign dignitaries, was in Soviet hands. The Tempelhof's former commander could not believe he was a prisoner. Behind the Soviet bombardment, Zhukov's 3rd Shock Army and his 47th Army erupted into the city streets. Zhukov threw in the 1st and 2nd Guards tank armies after them. Zhukov wanted to take the city by the last day of April. The 1st of May was a national holiday in Russia, and Berlin, Zhukov thought, would make the perfect present. Soviet combat cameramen recorded every day of the battle. The struggle had raged for an entire week. At the center of the inferno, deep in the ground, inside the Hitler bunker, the author of all this misery tried to salvage something out of the disaster. Nazi leaders were still hoping for a negotiated surrender, while above them, the aspirations and the monuments of the 1,000-year Reich were being consumed by flame. With the stubbornness of the doomed, the Germans fought on in the wreckage of their past. Berlin's center towered the Reichstag, set afire in 1933 by Nazi provocateurs so they could use the crime as an excuse for a reign of terror. In 1945, the Reichstag burned again. The Reichstag was an objective. They had been clawing their way toward it for years. Now it was within their grasp. It was April 30th, 1945. Zhukov gave the order to finish off the enemy at 6:30 that evening. General Weidling, commander of Berlin, gave himself up at 6 o'clock in the morning on May 2nd. By 3 that afternoon, Weidling's troops had joined him in captivity, 70,000 of them. And then the silence fell. The soldiers had almost forgotten what silence was. Berlin was not quite the end. The Nazis still held out in Prague, with 1 million troops in central Czechoslovakia and southern Germany. 5th of May, the Czechs rose in Prague, bringing their long underground resistance to the Nazis to open confrontation. To the west of Prague, General Patton's Third Army had halted. The agreement had been that the Soviets should take the city. Marshal Konyav's 1st Ukrainian Front had been given the assignment, but it had been fighting near Berlin. Czechs were very brave, but perhaps a little premature. Prague radio broadcast an SOS. The Czechs were hopelessly outweighed. The massacre began. On the morning of May the 6th, Konyav's troops wheeled south, striking at the remnants of the German Army Group Center. By the afternoon of May the 7th, with German planes constantly overhead, the situation in Prague had become critical. Next day, Konyav's tanks reached the far side of the mountains, north of Prague. Prague was a day's fast driving away. On May 9th, the leading troops of the Red Army swept into Prague. Marshal Konyav was made an honorary citizen of the Czech capital. The impromptu victory parade included men of the Czechoslovak Corps that had fought alongside the Soviets. Even after they had liberated their own land, the Soviets lost 1 million men in Eastern Europe. The Czechs laid the Soviet dead near their own, those who had died in the Prague uprising. busy erasing memories. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted a mere 12 years. To some, it had been a lifetime. They thought they had found Hitler, but Hitler's body had been burned so badly it was hard to identify. It was immediately apparent that this was Goebbels. He had poisoned himself, his wife, and his 6 daughters. What had been one of the proudest cities in Europe had been gutted. May 1945, the new order of the Nazis had displaced millions all over Europe. Italians, Russians, Poles, French, Czechs, Yugoslavs. Once doomed to slavery, now they hurried home. The joy of victory, the realization finally that the war was over. The Allied military commanders on both fronts accepted the Nazi surrender in 2 ceremonies. Eisenhower on May 7th in France, and Zhukov at midnight on May 8th in Berlin. General Chuikov, the hero of Stalingrad, had also commanded Zhukov's spearhead at Berlin. Starvation hung over Berlin. At first, all there was to eat was what the Red Army provided. difficulties increased as the Berliners slowly returned to their ruined city. Zhukov appointed General Birzarin commandant of Berlin. Birzarin's first orders were for food supplies. Bread, fats, sugar, salt, potatoes. A rationing system was vital. The Soviets settled down to their occupation of Berlin. Among them, Lydia Ovcharenko.
Who am I? Just an ordinary country girl. I finished high school, then the war began. I fought through the whole war, all of the Ukraine, the Crimea, right here to Berlin.
Zhukov walked among the evidence of the power of his artillery. Without question, Marshal Georgy Zhukov had established himself as preeminent among the Soviet generals. It was Zhukov who supervised the German surrender. May 8, 1945, the Allies assembled to accept the capitulation. British Air Marshal Tedder, Deputy Commander to General Eisenhower. General Carl Spaatz, Commander of the U.S. Strategic Air Force. Former Chief of the German High Command, Field Marshal Keitel. Villa in the eastern suburbs of Karlshorst. At midnight exactly, the formalities began, led by Zhukov.
Господа, здесь собрались по уполномочию Верховного Главнокомандования Красной Армии, заместитель Верховного Главнокомандования.
Assembled here are Marshal of the Soviet Union Georgy Zhukov,
По уполномочию Верховного Главнокомандования экспедиционными силами союзников, заместитель Верховного Главнокомандующего Экспедиционными силами союзников главный маршал
Air Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder,
присутствует генерал-полковник американской армии
General Carl Spaatz,
от французской армии, главнокомандующий французской армии, генерал
and General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, Commander-in-Chief of the French Army.
для принятия условий
The representatives of the German High Command have arrived.
главнокомандования вооруженных сил Германии прибыли уполномоченные Верховного главнокомандования германской армии. Я предлагаю приступить.
I thereby declare the proceedings open and order that the representatives of the German High Command be summoned into the room.
Keitel entered first.
Я обращаюсь к представителям германского Верховного главнокомандования с вопросом, имеют ли они
Do the representatives of the German High Command have in their hands the act of unconditional surrender? Have they read the act?
Я предлагаю подписать представителями германского Верховного главнокомандования.
I recommend that they sign it.
There were other signatures. The ordinary soldiers left theirs on the Reichstag. I'm from Moscow. The shortest way home is by way of Berlin. It was their only public comment on the unknown war. Our next story, the last battle of the unknown war. Honoring his pledge to the Western Allies, Stalin sent his armies against the Japanese in Manchuria in August of 1945. In 27 days, they destroyed the mighty Kwantung Army and pushed the last Japanese off the mainland of Asia.